The history of the British Army spans over 3.5 centuries and numerous European wars, colonial wars and world wars. For the late 17th century until the mid-20th century, the United Kingdom was the greatest economic and imperial power in the world, and although this dominance was principally achieved through the strength of the Royal Navy, the British Army played a significant role. In peacetime, Britain has generally maintained only a small professional volunteer army, expanding this as required in time of war, due to Britain's traditional role as a sea power. Since the suppression of Jacobitism in 1745, the British Army has played little role in British domestic politics, and, apart from Ireland, has seldom been deployed against internal threats to authority. The British Army has been involved in many global international conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War and both World War I and World War II. Historically, it contributed to the expansion and retention of the British Empire. The British Army has long been at the forefront of new military developments. It was the first in the world to develop and deploy the tank, and what is now the Royal Air Force had its origins within the British Army as the Royal Flying Corps. At the same time, the British Army emphasises the continuity and longevity of several of its institutions and military traditions. Origins. The English Army was first established as a standing military force in 1660. In 1707 many regiments of the English and Scottish armies were already combined under one operational command and stationed in the Netherlands fighting in the War of Spanish Succession. Consequently, although the regiments were now part of the new British military establishment, they remained under the same operational command, and so not only were the regiments of the old armies transferred in situ to the new army, so too was the institutional ethos, customs, and traditions of the old standing armies that had been created shortly after the restoration of the monarchy 66 years earlier. Stuart Asquith argues, many authorities quote the restoration of 1660 as the birth date of our modern British Army. While this may be true as far as continuity of unit identity is concerned, it isn't true in a far more fundamental sense. The evidence of history shows that the creation of an efficient military machine and its proving on the battlefield predates the restoration by 15 years. It was on the fields of Naseby, Dunbar and Dunes that the foundations of the British professional army were laid. The new model army was the first full-time professional army raised within the three kingdoms of England, Ireland and Scotland. It was created in 1645 by the English Long Parliament and it proved supreme in field. At the end of the First Civil War, the new model army survived attempts by Parliament to disband it. Winston Churchill described its prowess thus: "The story of the Second English Civil War is short and simple. King, lords and commons, landlords, merchants, the city and the countryside, bishops and presbyters, the Scottish army, the Welsh people, and the English fleet, all now turned against the new model army. The army beat their lot." Having survived Parliament's attempts to disband it, the new model army prospered as an institution during the interregnum. It was disbanded in 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. At his restoration, Charles II sought to create a small standing army made up of some former royalist and new model army regiments. On the 26th of January 1661, Charles II issued the royal warrant that created the first regiments of what would become the British Army. Although Scotland and England maintained separate military establishments until the Acts of Union 1707, King Charles put into these regiments those cavaliers who had attached themselves to him during his exile on the European continent and had fought for him at the Battle of the Dunes against the Roundheads of the Protectorate and the French allies. For For political expediency he also included some elements of the new model army. The whole force consisted of 2 corps of horse and 5 or 6 of infantry. It is, however, on this narrow and solid basis that the structure of the English army was gradually erected. The horse consisted of 2 regiments, the Life Guards and the Blues, formed by Lord Oxford, out of some of the best new model army horse regiments. The foot regiments were Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, the Royal Scots, and the 2nd Queen's Royals. Many of Charles's subjects were uneasy at his creation of this small army. Pamphleteers read tracts voicing the fear of a people who within living memory had experienced the rule of the major generals and had liked neither the imposition of military rule, or the costs of keeping an army in being when the country was not at war with itself or others. People also remembered the 11 years' tyranny of Charles I and feared that a standing army under royal command would allow monarchs in the future to ignore the wishes of Parliament. The English were not fully reconciled to the need for a standing army until the reign of William III, when the near perpetual wars with other European states made a modest standing army a necessity to defend England and to maintain her prestige in the world. But public opinion, always anxious of the bad old days, was resolved to allow itself no rest until it had defined the prerogatives of the Crown on this delicate point. Parliament finally succeeded in acquiring a control over the army, and under a general bill, commonly called the Mutiny Act, laid down the restrictions which, whilst respecting the rights of the sovereign, were likewise to shield the liberty of the people. It did this by making the standing army conditional on an annually renewed Act of Parliament. To this day, annual continuation notices are required for the British Army to remain legal. On paper, this also guarantees representative government, as Parliament must meet at least once a year to ratify the order in Council renewing the Army Act for a further year, as another measure to avoid a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of any one person. Responsibility for the various branches of the army and its administration were deliberately assigned to different high officials. Creation of British Army. The order of seniority for the most senior line regiments in the British Army is based on the order of seniority in the English Army. Scottish and Irish regiments were only allowed to take a rank in the English Army from the date of their arrival in England or the date when they were first placed on the English establishment. For example, in 1694 a board of general officers was convened to decide upon rank of English, Irish and Scots regiments serving in the Netherlands. The regiment that became known as the Scots Greys were designated as the 4th Dragoons because there were 3 English regiments raised prior to 1688 when the Scots Greys were first placed on the English establishment. In 1713, when a new board of general officers was convened to decide upon rank of several regiments, the seniority of the Scots Greys was reassessed and based on their entry into England in June 1685. At the time there was only one English regiment of dragoons, and so after some delay the Scots Greys obtained the rank of 2nd Dragoons in the British Army. 18th century organization. By the middle of the century, the Army's administration had developed the form which it would retain for more than 100 years. Ultimately, the main bodies responsible for the Army were: the War Office was responsible for day-to-day administration of the Army, and for the cavalry and infantry. The Board of Ordnance was responsible for the supply of weapons and ammunition, and administered the Royal Artillery and Royal Engineers. The Commissariat was responsible for the supply of rations and transport. It occasionally raised its own fighting units, such as bateaumen. None of these bodies were usually represented in the cabinet, nor were they responsible for overall strategy, which was in the hands of the Secretary of State for War. The resulting tangled lines of control often greatly hampered efficient operation through and beyond the Napoleonic Wars. In the field, a commander's staff consisted of an adjutant general and a quartermaster general. There were separate commanders of the artillery and commissary officers who handled the supplies. The commander of an army might also have a military secretary responsible for appointments, courts-martial and official correspondence. In the field, as in peacetime, the conflicting lines of responsibility often caused problems. Infantry and cavalry units had originally been known by the names of the colonels, such as Sir John Mordaunt's regiment of foot. This could be confusing if colonels succeeded each other rapidly, and two regiments had to be distinguished by the facing color in official correspondence because for several years, both had colonels named Howard. In time, these became the official names of the regiments. In 1751 a numeral system was adopted, with each regiment gaining a number according to the rank in the order of precedence. Sir John Mordaunt's regiment became the 47th Regiment of Foot. The later Jacobite risings were centered in the Scottish Highlands. For the late 17th century, the government had organized independent companies in the area from clans which supported the Hanoverian monarchs of the Whig governments, to maintain order or influence in the Highlands. In 1739 the first full regiment, the 42nd Regiment of Foot, was formed in the region. More were subsequently raised. For many years, Highland regiments were to be the most colourful and distinctive units in the British Army, retaining much of the traditional Highland dress such as the kilt. Towards the end of the 18th century, the battalion became the major tactical unit of the army. On the continent of Europe, where large field formations were usual, a regiment was a formation of 2 or more battalions, under a colonel who was a field commander. The British Army, increasingly compelled to disperse units in far-flung colonial outposts, made the battalion the basic unit. Under a lieutenant colonel, the function of the regiment became administrative rather than tactical. The colonel of a regiment remained an influential figure but rarely commanded any of its battalions in the field. Many regiments consisted of one battalion only, plus a depot and recruiting parties in Britain or Ireland if the unit was serving overseas, where more troops were required for war garrison duties. 2nd, 3rd and even subsequent battalions of a regiment were raised, but it was rare for more than one battalion of a regiment to serve in the same brigade or division. Strategy and role. For the late 17th century onwards, the British Army was to be deployed in 3 main areas of conflict, one of which was effectively ended at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The major theatre was often the continent of Europe. Not only did Britain's monarchs have dynastic ties with Holland or Hanover, but Britain's foreign policy often required intervention to maintain a balance of power in Europe. Within England and especially Scotland, there were repeated attempts by the deposed House of Stuart to regain the throne, leading to severe uprisings. These were often related to European conflict, as the Stuart pretenders were aided and encouraged by Britain's continental enemies for their own ends. After the Battle of Culloden in 1746, these rebellions were crushed. Finally, as the British Empire expanded, the army was increasingly involved in service in the West Indies, North America and India. Troops were often recruited locally to lessen the burden on the army. Sometimes these were part of the British Army, for example the 60th Regiment of Foot. On other occasions, the local forces were administered separately from the British Army, but cooperated with it. Troops sent to serve overseas could expect to serve there for years, in an unhealthy climate far removed from the comforts of British society. This led to the army being recruited from the elements of society with the least stake in it, the very poorest or worst behaved. The red-coated soldier, Thomas Lobster, was a much derided figure. 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War, which took place from 1755 to 1763, has sometimes been described as the first true world war, in that conflict took place in almost every continent and on almost all the oceans. Although there were early setbacks, British troops eventually were victorious in every theatre. Britain's main enemy was France. As was usual, the war can be said to have started in North America, where it was known as the French and Indian War. The early years saw several British defeats. The British units first dispatched to the continent were and trained in the bush warfare they met. To provide light infantry, several corps such as Rogers Rangers were raised from the colonists. During the war, General James Wolfe amalgamated companies from several regiments into an ad hoc unit, the Louisbourg Grenadiers. There were also disagreements between high-ranking British officers and the North American colonists. It was laid down that even the most senior provincial officers were subordinate to comparatively junior officers in the British Army. The first concern of the colonists' representatives was the protection of the settlers from raids by Indian war parties. While the British generals often had different strategic priorities, partly through the naval superiority gained by the Royal Navy, Britain was eventually able to deploy superior strength in North America, winning a decisive battle at Quebec. Similarly, in India, the French armies and those of the most powerful Indian rulers were defeated after a prolonged struggle, allowing the steady expansion of British-controlled territory in Europe. Although Britain's allies carried the main burden of the struggle, British troops eventually played an important role at the decisive Battle of Minden. Aftermath. The result of this war was to leave Britain as the dominant imperial power in North America, and the only European power east of the Mississippi. There was increasing tension between the British government and the American colonists, especially when it was decided to maintain a standing army in North America after the war. For the first time, the British Army would be garrisoned in North America in significant numbers in a time of peace. With the defeat of France, the British government no longer sought actively to curry the favor of Native Americans. Urged by his superiors to cut costs, Commander-in-Chief General Jeffrey Amherst initiated policy changes that helped prompt Pontiac's War in 1763, and uprising against the British military occupation of the former New France. Amherst was recalled during the war and replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Thomas Gage. American War of Independence. For the British Army, the American War of Independence had its origins in the military occupation of Boston in 1768. Tensions between the army and local civilians helped contribute to the Boston Massacre of 1770, but outright warfare did not begin until 1775, when an army detachment was sent to seize colonial munitions at Lexington and Concord. Reinforcements were sent to America to put down what was initially expected to be a short-lived rebellion. Because the British Army was under strength at the outset of the war, the British government hired the armed forces of several German states, referred to generically as Hessians, to fight in North America. As the war dragged on, the ministry also sought to recruit loyalist soldiers. 5 American units were placed on the regular army roster, though there were many other loyalist units. When the war ended in 1783 with defeat and the independence of the United States, many of the loyalists fled north to Canada, where many subsequently served with the British Army. The Army itself had established many British units during the war to serve in North America or provide replacements for garrisons. All but 3 dragoons and 2 Highland infantry regiments, the 71st and 78th Foot, were disbanded immediately after the war. The Army was forced to adapt its tactics to the poor communications and forested terrain of North America. Large numbers of light infantry were organized, and the formerly rigid drills of the line infantry were modified to a style known as loose files and an American scrambler. While the British defeated the colonists in most of the set-piece battles of the war, none of these had any decisive result, whereas the British defeats at the Battle of Saratoga and Siege of Yorktown adversely affected British morale, prestige and manpower. Napoleonic Wars. The British Army during the Napoleonic Wars experienced a time of rapid change. At the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1793, the army was a small, awkwardly administered force of barely 40,000 men. By the end of the period, the army had been through a series of structural, recruitment, tactical and training reforms, and its manpower had vastly increased. At its peak, in 1813, the regular army contained over 250,000 men. The British infantry was the only military force not to suffer a major reverse at the hands of Napoleonic France. The later 19th century. During the long reign of Queen Victoria, British society underwent great changes such as industrialization and the enactment of liberal reforms within Britain. The period was also marked by the steady expansion and consolidation of the British Empire. The role of the military was to defend the empire and, for the army, to control the natives. The Crimean War had so many blunders and failures, most famously the ill-advised charge of the Light Brigade, that it became an iconic symbol of logistical, medical and tactical failures and mismanagement. Public opinion in Britain was outraged at the failures of traditional methods in the face of modernization everywhere else in British society. The newspapers demanded drastic reforms, and parliamentary investigations exposed a multiplicity of grave problems. However, the reform campaign was not well organized. This allowed the traditional aristocratic leadership of the army to pull itself together and block all serious reforms. No one was punished. The outbreak of the Indian Rebellion of 1857 shifted attention to the heroic defense of British interests by the army, and further talk of reform went nowhere. The demand for professionalization was, however, achieved by Florence Nightingale, who gained worldwide attention for pioneering and publicizing modern nursing while treating the wounded. These 2 wars demonstrated that reforms were urgently needed to guarantee that the army could protect both the home nation and the empire. Nevertheless, reform did not take place until much later, when liberal governments enacted wide-ranging reforms from 1870 to 1881. These gave the army the form it would take at the outbreak of the First World War. The Industrial Revolution had changed the army's weapons, transport and equipment, and social changes such as better education had prompted changes to the terms of service and outlook of many soldiers. Nevertheless, it retained many features inherited from the Duke of Wellington's army, and since its prime function was to maintain the expanding British Empire, it differed in many ways from the conscripted armies of continental Europe. For example, it did not undertake large-scale maneuvers. Indeed, the Culloden maneuvers of 1853 involving 7,000 troops were the first such maneuvers since the Napoleonic Wars. First World War. The British Army during World War I could trace its origins to the increasing demands of imperial expansion together with inefficiencies highlighted during the Crimean War, which led to the Cardwell and Childers reforms of the late 19th century. These gave the British Army its modern shape, and defined its regimental system. The Isha Report in 1904 recommended radical reform of the British Army, such as the creation of an Army Council, a General Staff and the abolition of the office of Commander-in-Chief of the Forces and the creation of a Chief of the General Staff. The Haldane reforms in 1907 created an expeditionary force of 7 divisions. It also reorganized the volunteers into a new territorial force of 14 cavalry brigades and 14 infantry divisions, and changed the old militia into the Special Reserve to reinforce the expeditionary force. The British Army was different from the French and German armies at the beginning of the conflict in that it was made up from volunteers, not conscripts. It was also considerably smaller than its French and German counterparts. The outbreak of the First World War in August 1914 saw the bulk of the changes in the Haldane reforms put to the test. The British Expeditionary Force of 6 divisions was quickly sent to the continent, while the Territorial Forces 14 divisions and reserves were mobilized as planned to provide a second line. During the war there were 3 distinct British armies. The First Army was the small volunteer force of about 400,000 soldiers, over half of which were posted overseas to garrison the British Empire. This total included the regular army and reservists in the territorial force. Together they formed the BEF for service in France and became known as the Old Contemptibles. The Second Army was Kitchener's army, formed from the volunteers in 1914-1915, which was destined to go into action at the Battle of the Somme. The Third was formed after the introduction of conscription in January 1916, and by the end of 1918 the British Army had reached its peak of strength of 4 million men and could field over 70 divisions. The war also saw the introduction of new weapons and equipment. The Maxim machine gun was replaced by the improved and lighter Vickers and Lewis machine guns. The Brodie helmet was supplied for better personnel protection against shrapnel, and the Mark I tank was invented to try to end the stalemate of trench warfare. The vast majority of the British Army fought in France and Belgium on the Western Front, but some units were engaged in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Africa and Mesopotamia, mainly against the Ottoman Empire. One battalion also fought in China during the siege of Tsingtao.